Nobody laughed louder than the women on the 14th floor. They passed the news like a lit match, quiet at first, then consuming everything in seconds. Claire Dawson, Director of Strategic Development at Harrington Capital, had invited the night shift janitor to be her +1 at her ex-boyfriend's wedding. Not a colleague, not a friend from outside the office. The man who emptied the trash cans, refilled the paper towels, and buffed the marble floors until they shone like mirrors at 2 in the morning. His name was Ethan Cole, and for 7 months he had been the most invisible person in that building until the moment he became the most talked about. Harrington Capital occupied the top 6 floors of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, the kind of building that made people straighten their spines just walking through the lobby. The company managed the kind of money most people never saw in a lifetime, and the culture reflected that, polished, relentless, and unforgiving of weakness. People worked late not because they were asked to, but because being seen leaving before 9 was a quiet form of surrender. The floors smelled of expensive cologne and cold ambition, and the fluorescent lights never quite turned all the way off, even at midnight. As if the building itself refused to sleep, Ethan had come to this building through a door most people in the tower had never noticed. He was 34 years old, with dark eyes that observed more than they revealed, and hands that had once drawn structural blueprints and were now more accustomed to mop handles and trash liners. He was not a large man, but he carried himself with a kind of stillness that people either ignored entirely or found, without quite knowing why, unsettling. He reported for his shift at 9 in the evening, worked until 5 in the morning, and rarely spoke to anyone unless spoken to first. He had been hired 6 months before the events of this story through a general staffing agency, and his personnel file listed his previous occupation simply as private sector non-specified, which was true, in the most minimizing way possible. What the file did not say was that Ethan Cole had, for 8 years before his life reorganized itself around loss, been one of the most promising young architects in the city. He had worked at a mid-sized firm called Vance & Carr, where he had designed 2 award-nominated residential buildings and had been on the shortlist for a significant civic project that would have set his career on a different trajectory entirely. He had been good, not just technically competent, but genuinely talented, the kind of talent that showed up in the details, in the way light moved through a building he designed, in the way space felt generous, even when it was small. His colleagues had respected him. His clients had trusted him. His future had seemed, from all angles, settled and bright. Then his father got sick. A slow, expensive illness that required Ethan to travel back to his hometown in Indiana every other weekend, then every weekend, then for extended stretches that made consistent professional commitments impossible. And while Ethan was away, managing doctors and insurance paperwork, and the quiet devastation of watching a parent diminish, his business partner, at the small independent firm they had started together, a man named Marcus Webb, whom Ethan had known since college, began quietly reassigning projects, redirecting clients, and restructuring the partnership in ways that left Ethan legally and financially sidelined by the time he returned full-time. The details of what Marcus did were technically legal. They were also a clean and complete betrayal. Ethan spent 4 months consulting lawyers, then stopped. The cost of fighting was more than the cost of letting go, and he was already too hollowed out by grief to sustain the fight. His father died in March. By June, he had dissolved the partnership, paid off his remaining debts, and taken the janitorial position at Harrington Capital, not because it was the best option available to him, but because it required nothing of him beyond physical presence and basic competence. It asked nothing of his mind. It left him alone. And for a long time, that was the only thing he needed. Claire Dawson occupied the same building in an entirely different register. She was 31, with the kind of focused intensity that people described as cold because they didn't know what else to call it. She had graduated top of her class, joined Harrington at 24, and been promoted to director by 29, a record that the company still referenced in recruiting materials. She was rigorous, precise, and difficult to impress. She gave feedback bluntly, expected the same in return, and had no patience for the decorative social rituals that most of her colleagues mistook for professionalism. She was not cruel. She was exacting. The distinction mattered to her. even when it didn't seem to matter to the people on the receiving end of her evaluations. Their first real exchange had happened 3 weeks after Ethan started his shift. He had been moving a floor buffer down the corridor outside the conference rooms when Claire came out of a late meeting, laptop bag over one shoulder, heels clicking a precise rhythm against the polished floor. She had nearly walked into the electrical cord he'd stretched across the hallway. She'd stopped, looked at the cord, looked at him, and said, with the flat precision she applied to everything, "You've been leaving this cord here every Tuesday for 3 weeks. It's a liability." Ethan had looked up at her calmly and said, "I've been here every Tuesday for 3 weeks. You're the first person who stayed late enough to trip over it." She had stared at him for a moment, not with offense, exactly, but with the faint recalibration of someone who had not expected to be answered. Then she'd stepped over the cord and walked away without another word. After that, they found each other in the building's quietest hours, with a frequency that, in retrospect, seemed less like coincidence than like a kind of gravitational inevitability. She would be in the break room making coffee at 11. He would be refilling the supply cabinet. She would be working in the glass-walled conference room on the 12th floor. He would be mopping the corridor outside. They exchanged words that were sharp. More often than not, she criticized the way he stacked cleaning supplies in the maintenance closet she shared a wall with. He told her that the stack of coffee cups she left on her desk every night was the single most inconsiderate habit he'd encountered in the entire building. And she had not apologized, but had, from that night forward, taken her cups to the kitchen herself. They argued about nothing and everything, in the particular way that two intelligent people argue when proximity has created a familiarity neither one has formally acknowledged. Their colleagues watched these exchanges and concluded, with the comfortable certainty of people who hadn't actually listened, that Claire looked down on Ethan, that the friction between them was the natural product of hierarchy, a director and a janitor, who occupied the same space and resented each other for it. What their colleagues did not see was that Claire Dawson had never, in 7 months, dismissed Ethan Cole. She noticed everything about him. The way he read on his break, not a phone, but an actual book, technical and dense. The way he moved through the building without resentment, without the performative invisibility that some people in his position adopted as a coping mechanism. The way he looked at her, when they argued, as an equal, not with deference, not with resentment, but with the level, direct attention of someone who had decided she was worth being honest with. She did not examine why she noticed these things. She filed them away with the same careful precision she applied to everything else in her life, and she did not ask herself what she intended to do with them. The invitation arrived on a Thursday morning in late October, slipped into her office mail tray between a corporate memo and a client prospectus. Claire recognized the paper stock before she recognized the handwriting thick cream cardstock, the kind that communicated expense before content. The names on the inner envelope confirmed what some part of her had already braced for. Daniel Hartley and Vivian Morrow, together with their families, request the pleasure of your company. The ceremony was scheduled for the first Saturday of December, at the Alderton Estate in Lake Forest. 45 minutes outside the city, the Alderton Estate, which Vivian Morrow's grandfather had purchased in the 1940s, and which had since hosted 2 gubernatorial fundraisers and 1 nationally televised charity gala, an estate that communicated, in every architectural syllable, the scale of the world Daniel had chosen over her. Claire set the invitation down on her desk and looked at it for exactly 30 seconds. Then she placed it in the top drawer, went back to the proposal she had been reviewing, and did not mention it to anyone for a full week. Those who knew Claire's history with Daniel knew the outline, if not the depth. They had dated for 3 years, a serious, adult relationship that most of their mutual acquaintances had considered likely to result in marriage. Daniel had been a junior executive at a consulting firm when they met, ambitious and charming, and possessed of the particular confidence of men who had been told since childhood that they were exceptional. Claire had helped him, not in the small and invisible ways that sometimes go unacknowledged, but in concrete, documentable ways. She had connected him with 2 clients who became cornerstone accounts for his firm, had coached him through a pivotal board presentation, had used her own professional credibility to open doors he had not yet earned the key to. She had done it because she loved him, because she believed in him, and because she had not yet understood that some people treat love like a resource to be extracted rather than a condition to be sustained. Daniel had ended their relationship on a Friday evening 18 months earlier, with the kind of calm, prepared delivery that suggested he had rehearsed it. He was pursuing something else, he said. He hoped she understood. 3 months later, he announced his engagement to Vivian Morrow, whose father chaired the board of the firm Daniel worked for. The social calculus was obvious to everyone who saw it. Claire had not cried in front of anyone. She had gone home, locked the door, and allowed herself exactly one weekend of something she would never have named grief in public. Then she had come back to work on Monday, and been, by every measurable standard, more effective than she'd ever been. What she had not done, in the 18 months since, was fully close the wound. She had sealed it. She had plastered over it with enough professional achievement and forward motion that it was invisible to everyone around her. But it was still there, and the cream-colored invitation in her top drawer pressed against it with the quiet, insistent accuracy of a probe, finding something that had been buried but not dissolved. She was thinking about the invitation on the Thursday evening, 11 days after it arrived, when she encountered Ethan in the east corridor of the 12th floor. He was moving a wheeled trash cart, and she was walking back from the copy room with a stack of quarterly reports. They stopped within a few feet of each other, in the way they sometimes did, not blocking each other's path, exactly, but not immediately redirecting away from it either. She looked at the corridor ahead of her. He looked at the cart handle. There was a moment of the particular silence they had developed between them. The kind that wasn't uncomfortable so much as full. She said it without planning to. "Come with me to a wedding." He looked up at her. His expression did not change immediately, but something behind his eyes sharpened the look of someone recalibrating. "I'm sorry? A wedding. First Saturday of December. I need someone to come with me." He studied her face the way he sometimes did, with that level, unrushed attention that she had never gotten fully used to. Why me? She hadn't prepared an answer, which meant the one she gave was the truth. "Because you don't pretend." She paused. "Everyone I could ask would spend the whole event performing something. I don't have the energy for that." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "No." She had not expected that. "No? No," he repeated, not unkindly. "I don't know whose wedding this is or what you want from me, but it sounds like you want me to be a prop in something. And I'm not interested in being a prop." She felt the edge of irritation, which was how she felt most things, sharp and clarifying. "I told you what I want. Someone real. You told me what you don't want," he said. "That's not the same thing." The conversation could have ended there. She could have walked away. She had done it before. In exchanges with him that had reached a point of genuine resistance. Instead, she said something she had not said to anyone in a very long time. "His name is Daniel. He left me to marry someone with a better last name. He invited me to the wedding because he thinks I'm still hurting enough that it will bother me." She paused. "I want to show up. I want to be there and be fine. And I want someone beside me who is actually on my side." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. The cart handle was still in his hands. The corridor was very quiet. "I'll think about it," he finally said. She almost told him that wasn't good enough. Instead, she nodded once and walked away and did not look back. And he stood there in the corridor for another minute after she was gone, looking at nothing in particular, before he went back to work. By Monday, the entire 14th floor knew. This was not a mystery. The building's informal information network operated with a speed and efficiency that would have impressed the analytics team had anyone thought to study it. Someone had seen them in the corridor. Someone else had overheard the tail end of the conversation. The details multiplied in the retelling the way details always do, gaining color and implication with each pass, until the version that circulated by mid-morning was approximately this. Claire Dawson had invited the janitor to her ex-boyfriend's wedding as a revenge stunt because she knew it would embarrass Daniel, and because she had finally, spectacularly, lost her carefully maintained composure. The reactions were predictable and varied only in their degree of meanness. In the break room, someone said, "She's really hitting rock bottom." In the elevator, someone else said, "Do you think she's doing it to humiliate him or herself?" A group of junior analysts laughed openly when the subject came up. The particular laughter of people who are grateful to have something to laugh at that isn't them. A few of Claire's closer colleagues expressed something closer to confused concern, reaching out with the kind of careful, probing messages that were really questions disguised as support. No one asked Ethan anything. He was, in the social architecture of the building, effectively transparent. A few people glanced at him differently when they passed him in the hallways, a longer look, edged with something between curiosity and contempt. One of the senior analysts, a man named Greg, whose primary personality trait was his own self-satisfaction, made a comment in Ethan's presence about people knowing their place. Ethan continued what he was doing without visible response, which was, though Greg did not understand this, the most complete form of dismissal available. What Ethan felt, in the privacy of his own thoughts during those first days, was something more complicated than the performance of indifference he offered publicly. He was not accustomed to being the subject of other people's conversations. His invisibility had been, for the past year, almost a form of shelter, the deliberate smallness of a man who had once been seen and had found the experience, ultimately, destructive. He had chosen this work precisely because it asked nothing of him that could be taken, mocked, or used against him. And now, without asking for it, he had been drawn into a drama that placed him squarely in the center of a room full of people who found him amusing in the wrong way. He had, in the 48 hours after their conversation in the corridor, decided not to go. The logic was clean and self-protective. He owed Claire Dawson nothing. Her reasons for choosing him were likely less flattering than she had made them sound, and the probability of the evening being anything other than uncomfortable was low. He had rehearsed a brief, polite decline. Then she appeared at the maintenance room door on Wednesday evening, which she had never done before, and held out a folded note with an address on it. The address of a men's clothing store on Michigan Avenue. Saturday morning, 10 o'clock. I'll have something held for you. She said it with the matter-of-fact efficiency of someone closing a business decision, as if the question of whether he was going had already been settled. Then she started to leave. He said, "I told you I'd think about it." She stopped with her back to him. "I know what you're thinking. That I want to use you as a statement, don't you?" She turned around. The corridor light fell across her face at an angle that caught the tension around her jaw. Not anger, exactly, but the particular tightness of someone holding something in. "No," she said. "I want to walk into that room and feel like myself. I haven't felt like myself in a very long time. You're the only person I know who doesn't require me to perform something." He looked at her carefully. There was nothing in her expression that asked for his pity. That, more than anything else she had said, moved him. "I'll pay for my own suit," he said. "I'm not paying for it. I'm having one held." "There's a difference?" "Yes. One is a transaction. The other is a request between people who are." She paused, and something shifted in her face. Almost imperceptibly at the very least. "Acquaintances." He said nothing for a moment. Then, 10 o'clock. She nodded once and left. And he stood in the maintenance room doorway and understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that he had already made the decision some time before she appeared, that the only question had been whether he would admit it to himself. He had not expected her to know. The file was old, stored in a general HR archive that covered the building's staffing agency, contractors not particularly sensitive, not sealed, but also not the kind of thing a director of strategic development would have any reason to look at. Yet 2 days before the wedding, when they met at the clothing store on Michigan Avenue and sat across from each other in the quiet seating area while an attendant brought coffee, Claire said something that stopped him mid-sentence. She had been asking him, carefully and without pushing, whether he had always worked in facilities management, and he had given his standard answer non-committal, redirecting when she said, "I looked at your file. I'm sorry if that feels like a violation. I know it probably does." He went very still. She continued. her eyes steady on the coffee cup in her hands rather than his face. "You designed the Callaway residences. I drove past them once, about a year ago. Before I knew you worked here, I remember thinking whoever designed those had a real understanding of how light moves." She paused. "Then I saw the credit in a professional database. E. Cole, Cole Architecture." He said nothing for a long moment. The store was quiet around them, soft music, and the occasional rustle of fabric. "Why were you looking up my file?" She looked up then. "Because Greg made that comment last week. In front of you, and I wanted to know if there was anything in your personnel record that might have been mishandled, anything that could be used against you or affect your position here." He processed that. "You were protecting me. I was checking. You've done it before," he said. It was not a question. Something had been assembling itself in his mind over the past weeks, small incidents. Moments that had seemed random at the time. The department review 3 months ago, when 2 cleaning staff had been flagged for redundancy, and somehow he had not been among them. The manager who had complained about him once, directly to the facilities director, and had been inexplicably redirected. He had attributed these things to luck and to institutional randomness. Looking at her now, he understood they had been neither. She didn't deny it. "You're a competent person in a position where competent people get ground down easily. That's not a reason to protect someone." "No," she said, meeting his eyes. "It isn't." The silence between them was of a different quality than the silences they'd shared in the corridors of the office building. Less friction, more weight. He said, "Eventually, Marcus Webb is still running projects in this city, still winning contracts." He kept everything. She nodded slowly, without filling the space with reassurance or outrage. "I let it go," he said. "Not because I forgave him. Because fighting it was going to cost me more of myself than I had left to spend." He looked at his coffee. "I miss the work. The actual work. Not the industry, not the politics. Just the thing itself, designing something and having it be real." She listened without interruption. And he understood, as he spoke, that this was itself unusual, that Claire Dawson was not a person who listened to many people, and that the quality of her attention was something to take seriously. When he finished, she said, quietly, "Come back to it. When you're ready, you make it sound simple. I know it isn't." She looked out the window at the street. None of the things worth doing are. The Alderton estate, in Lake Forest, was exactly what its reputation promised. A sweep of manicured grounds, a limestone facade, the color of winter clouds, and an interior that communicated old money with the casual authority of something that had never needed to try. The guests arrived in a procession of dark cars and expensive coats, greetings exchanged in the foyer with the practiced warmth of people who saw each other at events like this twice a year and called it friendship. Ethan had worn his own suit charcoal, well cut. A remnant of his previous life that still fit because he was essentially the same person he had always been, only differently positioned. He had driven them in his own car, which Claire had not commented on. When they walked through the entrance together, he was aware of the way certain eyes tracked them, the same assessments that had been circulating at the office, now performed by strangers who had no context at all. He had been looked through most of his adult life without minding. Being looked at and found lacking was a slightly different experience, and he felt it in his chest as something quiet and cold. The first incident happened at the coat check. A young attendant, taking his coat, said, "Are you with the hotel staff?" With a tone that managed to be both polite and annihilating. Ethan said no and gave his name. The attendant wrote it down and handed him a ticket without further comment. Claire, who had seen it, said nothing, but when they moved into the main reception room, she placed her hand briefly at the small of his back, not dramatically, not as a performance, just for a moment, and the gesture was so natural and unannounced that it nearly destabilized him. Daniel Hartley materialized within 20 minutes. He was taller than Ethan had pictured, with the kind of ease that comes from never having worried seriously about money, and he greeted Claire with a smile that was 20% genuine warmth and 80% triumph, poorly hidden. "Claire, "So glad you came." He shook Ethan's hand and said his name without quite retaining it, the handshake of a man who has already decided the other person is unimportant. Ethan returned it with the handshake of a man who had, at various points, navigated rooms far more technically treacherous than this one. "You look well," Daniel said to Claire. "I am well," she said, with the particular flatness that in her was not rudeness but precision. A group of Daniel's friends descended shortly after men in their mid-30s, who had the overlapping vocabulary of people who had attended the same schools and worked in adjacent industries. One of them, introduced as Carter, made a comment about Ethan's work, the kind of comment designed to be overheard and laughed at by the group. It was dressed up in enough social plausibility that a direct response would have seemed oversensitive. Ethan said nothing. He had learned, in the past year, that silence can be its own form of refusal. What he noticed, standing in that room among people who had every social advantage, and were using all of them, was that Claire was afraid. Not visibly, her posture was impeccable, her expression composed to the degree that most people in the room would have read her as completely untouchable, but her right hand, where it rested at her side, trembled faintly. For just a moment, before she controlled it, he stepped slightly closer to her, not reaching for her, just present. She did not look at him, but he saw something in her profile shift, a loosening, barely measurable, as if proximity itself was a thing her body recognized. He stayed beside her through the cocktail hour, deflecting comments with the quiet competence of someone who had nothing to prove and therefore nothing to be threatened by. He brought her water when her glass was empty. He redirected a conversation that was spiraling toward cruelty with a single interjected sentence and the same blank attention he had perfected in the office hallways. And slowly, imperceptibly, the space around them settled, not because anyone had accepted them, but because Ethan had made it clear, without a single dramatic gesture, that he was not going anywhere. The ceremony was held in the estate's main hall, candlelit and lavishly decorated, with a string quartet and 200 guests seated in gilded chairs. Ethan sat beside Claire and watched her watch the couple at the altar. He could not fully read her expression. It was not grief, or not simply grief. It was something more complex. The face of a person who has understood something true about their own history and is deciding what to do with that understanding. She did not look at Daniel the way someone looks at the thing they have lost. She looked at him the way someone looks at a door they have permanently closed. After the ceremony, during the reception, the guests moved through a series of interconnected rooms where each conversation was a negotiation and every compliment contained a subtext. A woman who identified herself as a close friend of Vivian's told Claire she was so brave for coming, with an inflection that made bravery sound like a synonym for foolishness. A man who had known Daniel for years looked at Ethan with open, unembellished confusion. Claire handled all of it with the composure of someone who has been practicing calm under pressure since early childhood and has gotten very good at it. But when they stepped out for a moment onto the terrace, the air outside was cold and clean, and the lake beyond the grounds was very dark, and she stood at the stone railing with her coat closed around her. Ethan said, "You didn't come here to hurt him, did you?" She took a moment before answering. "No. What did you come for?" She was quiet for a long time, looking at the water. "To prove to myself that I could. That being in the same room with a version of my past couldn't still reach me." She paused. "I've been waiting to feel nothing. I thought if I came and felt nothing, it would mean I was finished with it. And I feel something," she said, without drama. "But it's not what I thought it would be." He waited. "I'm angry," she said. "Not at him. At the time I spent. At the version of myself who needed someone else's opinion of me to feel legitimate." She turned to look at him, and the candlelight from inside crossed her face through the glass doors behind them. "I don't feel that way around you." He was very still. "You've never once treated me like my value was something to be assessed," she said. "You've disagreed with me and argued with me and told me when I was wrong, but you've always talked to me like I was already worth talking to." She stopped. Then, quietly, "Do you know how rare that is?" He did know, because the person who had most recently done the same for him was standing in front of him, on a cold terrace above a dark lake, wearing a coat that was slightly too formal for the weather, and looking at him with an expression that was, for the first time since he'd known her, entirely unguarded. "Why did you choose me?" he said again, the same question he had asked in the corridor months ago. "Really?" She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Because I've been paying attention to you since the first week you came to work in that building. Because the more I knew about you, the more I understood that you are the most quietly exceptional person I have met in a very long time. And because when I thought about walking into that room tonight and being okay, you were the only person I could imagine being okay beside." The terrace was very quiet. The music from inside reached them in muffled waves. He said, "Claire." She said, "I know." The speeches came after dinner. Daniel's best man gave a long, polished toast that managed to reference 3 different investment properties in the first 2 minutes. Vivian's sister cried through hers in a way that was genuinely lovely. And then the microphone passed to Claire. Everyone in the room had known she was on the program Daniel had included her. Perhaps out of cruelty, perhaps out of something more complicated, as one of 3 distinguished guests asked to say a few words. Most of the people in the room expected performance. The woman who had been Daniel's most significant relationship, standing up to address his wedding. They were ready for grace under pressure, for the dignified and carefully worded speech of a woman who had rehearsed her composure. Some of them were waiting for the alternative, the slip, the edge, the single honest syllable that would define the evening and be repeated for years. Claire stood at the microphone with the same posture she brought to every boardroom, every presentation, every difficult conversation she had ever navigated. She looked out at the room with those still, level eyes, and she began. "There was a time in my life," she said, "when I believed that love was something you earned, that if you worked hard enough, gave enough, built enough, made yourself indispensable to the right person in the right way, that it would be returned, that the equation would balance." She paused. The room was very quiet. "I was wrong about that. And I'm grateful I learned it." Even though the lesson was expensive, she looked, for one moment, at Daniel. Her expression was neither warm nor cold. It was simply honest. "Thank you," she said, "for walking away. Because it taught me what I actually wanted and what I actually deserved." She let that land. Then she turned her head and she looked directly at Ethan. He was sitting 12 feet from her, at a table of people who had spent the evening performing their social positions like a professional obligation. And he was watching her with those dark, still eyes that had watched her for 7 months and never once flinched. "There is a person in this room," Claire said, into the microphone, into the silence, to the 200 people who had come to celebrate a wedding and had no idea they were about to witness something else entirely, "who has never once required me to be smaller than I am. Who has disagreed with me, argued with me, called me out when I was wrong. Who has shown up, every single night, to a job that a lot of people in this room would consider beneath them, and who has done it with more dignity than most of the people I know, who hold titles and offices." Her voice stayed steady, the way it always stayed steady. But there was something different in it now, not restraint, but something that had moved through restraint and come out the other side. "I didn't bring him here to make a statement," she said. "I brought him here because he is the only person I've wanted beside me in a very long time, and because I have not been brave enough, until tonight, to say that out loud." The room did not make noise. The room held its breath in that particular way rooms do, when something true has been said in a space that was designed for something rehearsed. Ethan sat very still. His hands were flat on the table in front of him, and his chest had done something involuntary that he could not name and did not try to. He looked at her at the microphone, and she was looking at him, and between them was 7 months of corridors and arguments and silences, and the specific chemistry of 2 people who had recognized each other across a room and spent considerable time refusing to say so. She said, "His name is Ethan," and then, because she was Claire, because she had always been precise, even in her most unguarded moments, she smiled small and real, and directed entirely at him and said, "And I am apparently terrible at telling people things I should have told them considerably sooner." She stepped away from the microphone. The room exhaled. The reception came apart in slow motion after that. Daniel was not, to his credit, openly ugly about it. His upbringing had given him enough social machinery to maintain a surface, but he found Ethan once, near the bar, and said something low and precisely worded that was designed to sting. To establish the distance of rank between them, Ethan looked at him with those level, untroubled eyes and said, "I know who I am. Do you?" and walked away. Vivian's family was, in the manner of old families absorbing unexpected events, glacially polite and impenetrably contained. The guests redistributed around the room in the subtle geometry of people recalculating their allegiances. A few people sought Claire out to tell her, in various registers, that she was extraordinary. Some of these compliments were genuine. Some were the social equivalent of ambulance chasing. Ethan found himself standing at the edge of the room near the windows, looking out at the dark grounds. When the weight of the evening settled on him in a particular way, he was, despite everything he had felt on the terrace and everything that had moved through him during her speech, afraid. Not of her, not of Claire, who was possibly the least frightening person he had encountered since she had knocked herself off a pedestal in his perception and revealed herself to be simply, painfully human. He was afraid of the mechanism of love itself, of the specific vulnerability of allowing another person to know the version of you that has already been disappointed once. He got his coat from the attendant, the same one from earlier, who this time said nothing, and stepped outside to the stone steps at the front of the estate, where the air was clean and the lights of the distant highway were visible above the tree line. He needed a minute. He was allowed a minute. He did not get a minute. She came through the doors 20 seconds behind him, coat already on, and stopped on the step just above his, which meant they were almost level, which was not something he had calculated but which seemed, in retrospect, appropriate. "You were going to leave," she said. "I was taking a moment. You were calculating the exit." He looked at her. She looked back. Her eyes in the outdoor light were very direct. "You're right that I was," he said. Because honesty was the thing he had always given her, even when it cost him. She came down the steps so they were fully level. The driveway gravel was pale in the darkness, and behind them, the estate hummed with the managed noise of an event that would continue for another hour without them. "I know what it means to have been careful for a long time," she said. "I know what it costs to let yourself be seen. I've been doing the math on staying protected for 3 years, and the return on that investment is nothing. It's just more alone." He said, "I'm not afraid of you. I know you're not. I'm afraid of being wrong again," he said. "About a person, about what I believed a person was." She nodded slowly. And her eyes, for the first time he had seen, were bright, with something that she did not try to redirect or control. "I'm afraid of that too," she said. "I am genuinely terrified of being wrong about this. About you. About whether the person I think you are is the person you actually are." She took a breath. "But I'm more afraid of never finding out." He looked at her for a long time. The cold came off the lake and moved through the trees and settled around them both. Then he said, "I miss architecture." She looked at him, slightly thrown by the shift. "I've been thinking about going back," he said. Slowly. Independently. Not for anyone else's firm mine. The way it should have been. "Yes," she said simply. "That's going to take a long time to rebuild." "Yes," she said again. "I'm not easy to know," he said. "I'm quiet, and I work strange hours, and I argue about things most people don't think are worth arguing about." She said, very quietly, "I know. I've been paying attention." He reached out, then, and took her hand. Just that her hand in his, on the cold stone steps of an estate they were both about to leave. The distant music fading behind them. She looked down at their hands, and then back up at him, and what was in her face in that moment was the same thing that had been in her voice at the microphone, something that had moved through restraint and come out the other side, real and unperformed and entirely hers. "Okay," he said. She said nothing, but she held on. 4 months later, the Harrington Capitol building looked exactly the same from the outside, which was true of most things that had changed completely on the inside. Ethan no longer worked the night shift. He had given notice in January politely, without drama, with the characteristic efficiency of someone who had decided on something and saw no reason to delay it. He had registered a sole proprietorship under the name Cole Design Studio, opened a workspace in Wicker Park, with a drafting table he'd found secondhand and a set of new software licenses, and begun. Carefully and without announcing himself to anyone who didn't need to know, the work of coming back. The change in Claire was less structural and more atmospheric. She still ran her department with the same exacting precision that had gotten her there, still gave blunt feedback and expected the same in return, still had no patience for the decorative social rituals of corporate life, but she took lunch breaks now, actual ones, away from her desk. She had stopped, somewhere around February, using the word fine as a complete emotional sentence. She had dinner with her sister for the first time in 8 months. Small things. The kind of changes that are invisible to anyone who isn't paying close attention, and entirely unmistakable to anyone who is. Their colleagues, for their part, had completed the emotional journey that groups tend to complete when confronted with something that violates their expectations: initial disbelief, then judgment, then reluctant curiosity, then something that, in the more generous among them, approached respect. The story of the wedding speech had traveled, as stories in closed professional ecosystems tend to travel, through the building with a speed that made the original gossip look slow. The people who had laughed the loudest were now, with the quiet recalibration of the socially self-aware, conspicuously silent on the subject. A few people, the ones who had always been decent, who had simply been swept up in the momentum of the group, went out of their way to acknowledge Ethan differently when they saw him. Greg, who had made the comment about people knowing their place, had been moved to a different department in March for unrelated reasons that nevertheless struck many observers as appropriate. It was an evening in early spring when Ethan came back to the Harrington Capitol building. He had a meeting with a client nearby, and the route took him past the glass tower. And without particularly planning to, he went inside. Not for any professional reason, not to visit, just to pass through. The lobby still smelled the same. The elevator still made the same quiet sound when the doors opened. The marble floors were still polished to the same mirror-bright finish that he had buffed himself. On more cold late evenings than he could count, he took the elevator to the 12th floor. He wasn't sure why. The office was quiet. It was past 7, and most of the day, staff had gone. He walked down the east corridor, past the conference rooms, past the copy room, past the place where he had stood with a floor buffer and a cord across the hallway and had, without knowing it, started something he hadn't been able to stop. Claire's office light was on. Of course it was. He knocked on the glass door. She looked up from her laptop, and the expression that crossed her face, brief, unguarded, before she composed it back into something resembling professional neutrality, was worth, he thought, more than he could have calculated on the best day of his previous life. She opened the door. "You're not on the schedule," she said. "I was in the neighborhood." She looked at him with those level eyes. "You designed a building 3 blocks from here, and you just happened to be in the neighborhood." "The building's not done yet," he said. "But yes." She stepped back to let him in. He walked to the window, the one that looked out over the city, the one he had cleaned, from the outside platform, on the second Tuesday of every month, and that looked entirely different from this angle. The city below was moving through its early evening routines, lights coming on in the towers, traffic thinning on the streets. The lake visible in the far distance as a dark, quiet presence beyond everything. She came to stand beside him. "Do you ever miss it?" she asked. "The night shift?" He considered. "Occasionally. It's very quiet at 2 in the morning. There's something honest about it. You always did your best arguing at midnight," she said. "You were always still at the office at midnight." "I have better habits now," she said. "You still stayed until 7:30 tonight. That's practically early for me." He smiled, and she saw it, and she did not bother suppressing the small answering smile that appeared on her own face, because she had stopped suppressing things around him as a general policy. He said, "I want to take you somewhere. This weekend." There's a building I've been looking at, an old warehouse on the south side. Industrial bones. Terrible current condition. The kind of project that would take a year and a half and requires a very specific kind of vision. He paused. I want to show you what I see when I look at it. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the city. Okay, she said. Saturday morning. Early, he said. The light is different early. I know, she said. I've been paying attention. He looked at her. She looked at him. Outside, the city made its ordinary, relentless, magnificent noise, and the light was changing the way. Light always changes at that hour slowly. Then, all at once, the sky moving through its private gradations from deep blue to something almost gold at the edges. Illuminating without fanfare, the unremarkable exterior of a glass tower in downtown Chicago, where, on the 12th floor, the office window was lit and two people were standing close enough together that a passerby, glancing up, would have had no way of knowing who had once mopped those floors and who had once run those meetings, only that they were there, and they were, by every indication, exactly where they wanted to be. He reached for her hand. She gave it to him without ceremony. The way she gave him most things now, without performance, without calculation. Simply and entirely, the city moved on beneath them.